Welcome to Contemporary Issues in Public Safety, Lecture 2, Part 1. Right now we're going to talk about Fire Administration, Chapter 3, Principles of Leadership. So the learning objectives are going to be the following. By the conclusion of this lesson, the learner will be able to describe the history of management theories, explain the difference found between leading and managing, explain concepts found in the managerial grid and how they impact organizations and the people in them. Explain modern management theories such as Theory X, Theory Y, and Theory Z, Maslow's hierarchy, motivation hygiene model, and others. Explain the difference that quality improvement and management by objectives have had on modern organizations. So let's begin. So, what is the difference between leadership and management? The difference is that people willingly follow leaders because they want to, not because they have to. The need to define management arose in the 19th century during the surge of factories and textile industries. There were two major contributors to this pre-classist era. One was Robert Owen, who had a strong interest in the welfare of his employees. He believed that character was a product of circumstances, such as environment and education. He is credited with being the creator of the modern human relations school of management. During this, he reduced work hours, he increased the working age, upgraded employee living conditions by improving housing, public works, and sanitation. He also established schools for children. On the other side of the contribution of this era, you have Charles Babbage, who is known as the father of the modern computer. He was responsible for the modern profit sharing plan, employee bonuses from suggestions, researched the analytical engine, which is acknowledged today as today's modern computer. All right, so then we have the established bureaucracy, which was introduced. The concept of bureaucracy was introduced by Max Weber. And this has been defined as the most logical and rational structure for a large organization. All the time, very often you hear people always refer to the bureaucracy and the red tape and bureaucracy. And basically it's really just it's the most commonly recognized definition of an organization, a classified organization. So, the characteristics of a bureaucracy include a well-defined hierarchy, division of labor and specialization, rules and regulation, impersonal relationships between managers and employees, competence, and records. I know you're probably thinking, oh, every bureaucracy does not entail competence, but idealistically, that's what they should entail. Now, the problems with bureaucracy include that there is an overwhelming acceptance of authority. People don't typically challenge authority in a bureaucracy because it's red tape. That's how it's supposed to be. Everything gets set up and people accept their roles. It's impersonal, thereby creating the red tape. Which means it makes it hard to get through somewhere. If things are not done by the book, sometimes they don't get done in a timely manner, which is always one of the biggest complaints of bureaucracy, the red tape. So there's also a division of labor, which alienates people from one another. And then there's the traditionally inflexible and inhumane. Meaning it's not, like we said, it's not very personal to people. Everybody is treated as far as respect to their role. So, the scientific management approach emphasizes empirical research for developing a comprehensive management solution. Productivity is increased by increasing the efficiency and production of employees. Frederick Taylor introduced scientific management through his studies at the Bethlehem Steel Company. It was here that he studies the motion details of a job. He developed a better method of performing the job and training workers. As a result of this, the practice of scientific management emphasizes empirical research for developing a comprehensive management solution. It focuses on worker and machine relationships. Managers are responsible for increasing an organization's productivity. Jobs are specific and procedural. And then we have Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor put forth the concept of soldiering, in which workers worked below their capacity because they thought higher productivity could lead to job elimination because there were no incentives, and they chose to follow the rule of thumb. Frederick Taylor also conducted the pig iron experiment, in which he attempted to incentivize workers who had once moved 12.5 tons of pig iron per day into moving 47.5 tons of pig iron per day. Taylor broke down the job into the smallest steps and optimally selected the best and efficient steps so that the crew would successfully move those 47.5 tons per day. Frederick Taylor also conducted the science of shoveling. His 4 principles of scientific management include: replace the rule of thumb work methods with methods based on a scientific study. Scientifically select, train, and develop workers. 3. Cooperate with them to ensure that the scientifically developed methods are followed. And 4. Divide work equally between managers and workers. Managers plan and workers perform. The biggest complaint about scientific management was that it was dehumanizing. By marginalizing everything to a science, forces workers to be dominated and to have to submit. Other major contributions to scientific management was by Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, who found the most efficient method for bricklaying. Frank also patented a special scaffolding method to reduce bending and breaching, which increases outputs. Through this, they coined motion study. Administrative management assumes that the executive has a level of authority endowed by the organization. Henry Fayol was the father of modern management, and he saw management as planning, organizing, and commanding. He introduced the 14 principles of management and wrote Administrative Industrial. Another major contributor to administrative management was Chester Bernard, who wrote The Functions of the Executive, which outlined the concepts of strategic planning, which guides the organization in pursuit of major objectives, and acceptance of authority. Authority flows downwards, and management is only allowed as much authority as people give him. That's Bernard's argument. He also argued that the executive had 3 major functions, which were establish and maintain an effective community system, hire and retain effective personnel, motivate those employees. There are 4 conditions in which employees will accept authority, in which you will read about. He argues that employees have a zone of indifference in which the manager is able to exercise authority. So the next era was the behavioral movement. The behavioral movement was an outgrowth of the classic management theory. It attempted to take into consideration employee behavior when looking for management solutions. Mary Parker Follett contributed to the human resource management field, arguing that powers should be shared cooperatively to solve conflict. She is credited for the creation of conflict resolution, and she raised the following concepts. Universal goal, which is an integration of individual effort into a synergistic whole. The universal principle, which is a circular or reciprocal response, emphasizing feedback to the sender. And the law of the situation, which emphasizes that there is no one best way to do something, because the best way is dependent on the situation at hand, which eventually led to like situational leadership, which we'll talk about later. She argues that there are three choices in conflict. She argues that there are three choices in conflict, which are domination, compromise, and voluntary submission. So, creative conflict is her answer to these. It's defined as cooperatively working with others to devise incentives and new ideas. And finally, we'll talk about the Hawthorne effect. Now, the Hawthorne effect was actually an experiment that completely went left. It was an experiment that was set out to prove that increased lighting would actually lead to higher productivity. However, what it did prove was that when people know that they are part of an experiment, a bias can occur in their behaviors. So basically, the people knew they were being observed to prove that increased lighting would improve work productivity. And so as they thought that they were increasing the light, people start working harder. So productivity went up, even without an increase in light. It's because people knew the experiment that they were taking part of, and that is the Hawthorne effect. So, the next era was the human relations management era. So, when morale and efficiency deteriorate, human relations are said to be poor. So, human relations management, there are actually two major contributions to this field, and they are from Abraham Maslow, which we discussed last week briefly when we discussed Maslow's hierarchy. Who, of course, like I said, developed his Maslow's hierarchy, in which demonstrated the needs of individuals from the bottom up. He admits that some people may skip a need in order to achieve self-actualization, which is at the top, such as security. And examples of people who do this are firefighters and police officers. They sacrifice their safety and security in order to reach, this high self-esteem or self-actualization that we need in order to feel fulfilled, which is at the top of the hierarchy. Needs are respectively, from the bottom up, physiological, safety and security, belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. The 5 categories can be reduced to 3, which include existence, relatedness, and growth. Douglas McGregor introduced theory X and Y, which are based on Maslow's hierarchy. Theory X assumes that the primary source of employee motivation is monetary. It assumes that employees lack ambition without incentive. McGregor thought that most teenagers subscribe to this type. He thought that most managers subscribe to this type. Theory Y assumes that employees are actually ambitious and self-motivated and anxious to accept greater responsibility and exercise self-control. The manager believes that given the right condition, most people want to do well at work, and they try to remove the barriers that prevent workers from actualizing their potential. So the shortfall for this is that it applies more to office settings than production. So after that, there was a theory Z that was later introduced, and it was developed by William Uchi of Japan, which places the freedom and trust with the employees instead of the focus being on the manager. And it assumes that workers actually have a strong loyalty and interest in their teamwork. So, let's talk about the managerial leadership grid and motivation hygiene theory for a minute. The managerial leadership grid attempts to determine the manager's place on a grid. that compares concerns for production and employee relationships. It is said to be used as a thermostat, but preferably a scale so that managers can orient themselves to a more favorable position. The motivation hygiene theory is where motivators are satisfiers. Motivators, which are satisfiers, or the nature of the work and job enriching experiences. And the hygiene factors are actually dissatisfiers, which are the environment surrounding the work. They include administrative and policy procedures. So, management must provide hygiene factors to avoid employee dissatisfaction, an intrinsic factor in the work to avoid employee dissatisfaction. It argues that people blame dissatisfaction on external factors. McClellan researched motivational patterns, and he identified the following: that achievement is meeting or exceeding a standard of excellence. Affiliation is maintaining close and personal relationships. And that power is being strong and influencing others. And that can be personalized, making others feel weak or socialized by empowering people. So those are a couple ways to obtain power. He argues that all three of these factors are present in people, but that achievement is the most critical to organizational success. Shortcomings are that people cheat to be successful. So there are several other management approaches and theories, and we'll go over those briefly. The other ones were much bigger. But there is the systems theory, which emphasizes communication within and external to the organization. And this theory argues that managers must communicate with employees and departments within the organization, but also with representatives and departments external to the organization as well. It includes subsystems, synergy, open and closed systems, system boundary, flow, and feedback. And then there is the contingency view, or the situational approach, which is the manager's duty to find an approach based on that situation. This is the manager's duty to find which approach is going to work best given the circumstances, basically. The environmental climate or physical characteristics may be different in each circumstance and may not provide the most efficient opportunity as it would in a different situation. Dr. Deming introduced total quality leadership, which promotes cooperation and coordination at all levels within every division. He is responsible for much of the success of Japan's industrial rebound post-World War II. He introduced Deming's 14 points of management and the 7 deadly diseases as far as business goes. Peter Drucker, he popularized management by objectives, in which employees and managers agree on the objectives for the employee, and then the employee is evaluated on how well he or she met those objectives. And then there is leadership, which is the traditional sense of leadership. It's changing organizations. It now can be witnessed in self-directed teams, inertia in their organization, and constant migration. Fireman leadership today is said to be visionary, developmental, service-oriented, ethically stimulating, facilitative, and clear in establishing expectations. Like leadership, management has changed so drastically over the past few decades that many assumptions previously made are no longer accepted and have been replaced by more modern ones. And you will learn more about leadership theory and approaches in the next chapter. The end.